Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. By now, we're all familiar with crimes and criminals on Wall Street. Bernie Madoff, Enron, Ivan Boesky, Barry Minko, and many others have become household names. Across the country, though, the startup world of Silicon Valley has been somewhat spared from any taint. The world of insanely great products, do no evil, and bringing friends together has, at least until recently, kept much of its patina. It's a world where people want to see the future and want to be a part of it. As such, it was and probably still is the most fertile ground for fraud. And perhaps no one has perpetrated a greater fraud than Elizabeth Holmes and her company Theranos. The story of a company whose mission was to tell you everything about your blood with a simple finger prick seemed too good to be true. And like most things that seem too good to be true, it was. The story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos is told edge-of-the-seat style by my guest, John Carreyrou, in his new book, Bad Blood. Carreyrou is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He's been awarded the George Polk Award for Financial Reporting, the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism, and it is my pleasure to welcome him here to talk about Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup. John Carreyrou, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. First of all, let's tell our listeners that may not know a little bit about what Theranos was set up to do. What was it that Elizabeth Holmes was selling from the very beginning?
So her premise and conceit was that with her system, her device, you would be able to prick a finger, get a drop or two of blood from your finger, and be able to run the full range of lab tests off of that tiny sample. And when you talk about the full range of tests, you're talking about anywhere from several hundred to several thousand blood tests. And that is simply something that hadn't been possible until then. It's very difficult technically to do. No one had cracked that nut. And so it would have been a scientific advance. And she argued that it would make blood testing more convenient and more user-friendly. People would get their blood tested more often, and therefore diseases would be diagnosed at an earlier stage. And as she liked to say at the height of her fame, people would have to say goodbye to loved ones, would not have to say goodbye to loved ones too soon anymore.
And she started this back in 2003 when she was 19 years old, a 19-year-old Stanford dropout. Talk a little bit about those early days, the very beginning of this.
Right. So she started her undergraduate studies in 2002, and then just 18 months later, as a 19-year-old sophomore, dropped out. She convinced her engineering professor, Channing Robertson, that it was a good idea, and he gave her his support and backing, and actually joined the fledgling company's board and accompanied her on some visits to venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road, the famous road where all the VCs in Silicon Valley are clustered, just a stone's throw from the Stanford campus. And at first, her idea was that she was going to create a little arm patch, sort of a wrist device that would have these microneedles and that would diagnose what ailed you and simultaneously inject the appropriate drug to cure you. She and her co-founder quickly realized that was more science fiction than reality. And so they pivoted to something that they thought was more feasible, which was inspired from the portable glucose monitors that diabetes patients use to test their blood sugar. But of course, Elizabeth Holmes wanted her device to test for everything, to pretty much every analyte in the blood.
To what extent did she believe this story early on? To what extent did she believe that she could do this?
I mean, I think she did. This isn't a Bernie Madoff-like story in the sense that Bernie Madoff in the late 80s at a certain point just decided to stop really investing his investors' money and decided to cheat, and then went on to cheat for 25 years. It's less black and white than that. I think Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford with a vision that she truly believed in and that she set about pursuing, and she really wanted to become a successful entrepreneur. And it's a story of someone who along the way encountered setbacks like most entrepreneurs do, trying to develop their technology, and and refused to sort of acknowledge them and fix things, and she refused to stop overpromising, and she continued to overpromise to investors, and eventually the gap between what she was promising she had achieved and what she had actually achieved got enormous, and it became this massive fraud, to use the Securities and Exchange Commission's own language.
What was the tipping point? It was around 2011, 8 years after she had started, that she started assembling this incredible high-powered board that included the likes of George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and the relationship with Murdoch and all the others. At what point do you think that it became clear to her that this may not work?
Well, there were 3 iterations of the technology. The first one that they worked on for a couple of years was a microfluidic system, and that was actually an ambitious attempt to change blood testing, and she ditched that after a few years in late 2007. And then the second iteration of the technology, as I described in the book, was essentially a converted glue dispensing robot. An engineer at Theranos had ordered this glue robot from a company in New Jersey and reprogrammed it, affixed a pipette to the end of the robotic arm, and reprogrammed it to mimic what a lab scientist would do at the bench. And so from that point forward, the Theranos technology was no longer really any great innovative technology, but she nonetheless, plowed forward and continued to make very grandiose representations to potential investors, to these board members that she recruited. She met the former Secretary of State, George Shultz, in 2011. He's always been passionate about science. He was wowed by what she claimed her technology could do. He joined the board. Then he introduced her to his buddies at the Hoover Institution, the likes of Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn, and Bill Frist and Bill Perry, who had been Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. And before long, she had this unbelievable board, with these former statesmen and retired military commanders with great resumes. However, none of them had any really experience in medicine or expertise in lab science. And in hindsight, that was a big red flag.
Was there some kind of Rubicon crossed when she started testing this, when she made the deal with Walgreens and started testing this on average citizens? Talk a little about that.
Right. I mean, that's really the very bright red line that she crossed. And that was in September of 2013. She commercialized effectively the Theranos fingerstick blood tests in Walgreens stores via partnership with Walgreens, and started out in one store in Palo Alto and then expanded to about 45 stores in the Phoenix area. And that's when this fraud goes from, overpromising to investors and perhaps defrauding investors to actually hurting patients and putting patients in harm's way. And that, to my mind, is what makes this scandal, egregious and on par, if not worse, than some corporate scandals that we've had in the past, such as Enron.
To what extent did she know that this was perpetrating a fraud? To what extent was she deluding herself? Talk a little bit about the human side of that with her, with Elizabeth Holmes.
Right. Well, it's hard to know what exactly was going on in her head. I tried to interview her for 5.5 months before my first investigative story in late 2015, and then sporadically tried again to get her to talk to me, tried again at the beginning of my book leave in late 2016, and she has steadfastly refused to speak to me. Based on all the reporting I've done, and this story has now consumed more than 3 years of my life, I can tell you that she was very much aware of the corners that were cut and the shenanigans in the lab. She herself requested updates on this secret program they had going that they called the Advia Project, which involved hacking a Siemens blood analyzer called the Siemens Advia 1800. And they were modifying it to try to adapt it to tiny fingerstick samples to make up for the fact that their own machine, the Edison, which was, at its heart, a converted glue dispensing robot, could only do a few tests. And she was absolutely on top of these shenanigans and requested frequent updates from the two people that that she had ordered to make the modifications.
Tell us a little bit about her being the celebrity that she became. She was on the cover of so many magazines. She was lauded. In 2015, Joe Biden visited the company. Talk about how she responded to that.
Right. She really began to bask in the limelight in a way that arguably no other Silicon Valley tech founder has. And sure, there have been Silicon Valley founders who have gotten a lot of press and who have made a lot of media appearances and continue to make a lot of media appearances. But she really basked in it in the way that a movie star almost would bask in it. We got to a point in 2014 and 2015 when she was giving a media interview almost every week, and she was appearing at a tech or a healthcare conference almost every week. When I came along and I started digging into the company, it wasn't even as I sort of monitored her public appearances, it got to the point where it wasn't even credible that she was actually running this company day to day, because she was her public profile was so high and she was so active with these public appearances. And as I learned from talking to my sources, the guy who was running the company day to day was her number 2 executive, Sunny Balwani, who was 19 years older and who was her boyfriend. And they were in the secret relationship that they were hiding from everyone, from employees, from the board of directors, from investors, and from the media.
Part of what made this publicity generate so effectively was this desire on the part of the media to want to find a star woman Silicon Valley executive or a star woman entrepreneur in the Valley. That's right.
There have really only been men that have achieved fantastic wealth and have become these revered tech founders in the Valley. Started with Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison. More recently, we've had the Google founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. We've had Twitter's founders, Jack Dorsey. We have more recently even Evan Spiegel. I'm forgetting, of course, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. All of these male tech founder billionaires, and there hasn't been a woman. There have been a couple of women who've had great careers in Silicon Valley. Marissa Mayer comes to mind. She was at the helm of Yahoo for several years, and Sheryl Sandberg was Zuckerberg's number 2 at Facebook. But they aren't founders. They were the hired help when they started in Silicon Valley. They were early employees of Google, and so they didn't found their own companies. And there was great appetite, I think, in Silicon Valley and beyond for the first female founder who would become a billionaire. And Elizabeth Holmes, the Valley had found finally that first woman.
Was there ever a point from your reporting that she realized this was never going to work?
I think to some extent that she is still convinced that she can somehow pull it off. And I'm told that she has accepted the inevitability of Theranos going bankrupt, and she's really just turning off the lights there. There are 20 employees left, and the company should be liquidated in a month or two. But I'm told that she's also beginning to pitch a new company, that she's already approached potential investors about a new company, and that it would involve some of what she had been working on at Theranos. And so I think to this day, she still thinks she can rebound from this and maybe pull off the original vision of this blood testing machine that would test a tiny sample of blood and that would even, that you would have at home. And you would prick your finger at home and you'd have your blood test results beamed wirelessly to your doctor. That was the original vision and the vision she's clung to all these years. And I think part of her is still hell-bent on achieving it.
Talk a little bit, John, about how you came to this story, because that's part of the book as well.
Right. I read a profile of Elizabeth Holmes in the New Yorker magazine in late 2014. That was what put her on my radar. She had rocketed to fame about a year prior. And there were a couple passages in that New Yorker story that struck me as odd. The main thing was this notion that a college dropout with no formal training in medicine or medical science could just drop out and create groundbreaking new medical technology. I thought that was far-fetched. And to be fair, I probably would not have done anything with that intuition if I hadn't gotten the tip a few weeks later. That tip came from a pathologist in the Midwest who moonlighted as the writer of an obscure blog called the Pathology Blog, which he spelled BLAWG. And this pathologist had also read the New Yorker story, and knowing a thing or two about blood testing also, was dubious about the claims in there and wrote a skeptical blog item on his blog and was quickly approached by a little band of Theranos skeptics, one of whom had been involved in patent litigation with Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, and had become convinced during that litigation that Theranos was a scam. And it so happened that man, Richard Fuse, had just made contact with an ex-laboratory director at Theranos who had just left the company. And so when I heard via the pathology blog writer and then Richard Fuse that there was an employee who had just left the company who was alleging all manner of wrongdoing, my ears pricked up, and I sought to get in touch with that employee and eventually did make contact with him. He was terrified. He was being harassed and hounded by Theranos lawyers. He would only speak to me on deep background. He made me promise that I would protect his identity, and eventually got him to confide in me and unburden himself, and that's how the whole reporting began.
And one of the other whistleblowers in this was George Schultz's grandson, Tyler Schultz, who was working for the company.
Right. Tyler became a corroborating source a few weeks later. And he had gone to work for Theranos after graduating from Stanford in the fall of 2013 and had worked at the company 8 months and had become convinced that the company was a fraud, and had even tried to talk sense into his grandfather and sort of open his eyes to what was going on, and failed, and had to leave Theranos a year before I started digging into the company and keep all of this bottled up. And I made contact with him, and he became a crucial corroborating source because he and another ex-colleague were able to corroborate and confirm a lot of the things that the lab director had told me. And unfortunately, Theranos soon was able to figure out that he was one of my sources and put him under an enormous amount of pressure, had lawyers ambush him at his grandfather George's house off the Stanford campus, and put him under pressure for months with legal threats, tried to get him to sign statements essentially recanting what he had told me and naming who my other sources were. And Tyler had to hire lawyers to represent him at the cost of close to $500,000, and amazingly was able to withstand this pressure and never gave in, never signed any document that the company put to him. And in large part, thanks to him, I was able to publish my investigation in October of 2015.
At its height, the company had some 800-plus employees. What were they all doing at that point?
Yeah, the interesting thing about Theranos is that when my first story came out, a lot of employees thought that I was wrong. I mean, Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, the two people at the head of the company, were telling them that I was wrong and that my reporting was essentially seeded by disgruntled former employees and by the two big incumbents in the lab industry, Quest and LabCorp. And so they believe them. The reason they believe them is that very few employees knew about the shenanigans in the laboratory. The company was set up in silos, and very few people had access to the laboratory where they had modified these Siemens machines. And so very few people knew that only a handful of tests were done with the Theranos device, and that the rest were done with third-party machines purchased from diagnostic equipment companies.
The SEC has made its determination on this and determined that fraud was going on here. Talk a little bit about the criminal side and what's happening on that front, particularly with the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco.
Right. So there's been a criminal investigation that started in December of 2015. So we're now 2.5 years into it, spearheaded by the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco. I'm told it's very active. Several key former Theranos employees have been interviewed, and I believe they're being lined up by the federal government as witnesses. Prosecutors have also gone out to Arizona and interviewed doctors and patients who were affected by Theranos' actions. And from everything that I hear, the investigation is very advanced, and criminal charges of Elizabeth Holmes and her ex-boyfriend Sunny Balwani are a distinct possibility.
Based on your reporting, and certainly not having talked to Elizabeth Holmes, but everything else that you have seen, at what point did this become criminal behavior?
Well, you could make the case that it was criminal behavior as soon as she went live with the blood tests that were, blood tests done with modified commercial machines for the most part, and a few of them with Theranos machines that didn't work and weren't properly validated. And you could say that for two reasons. One is that she raised most of the nearly $1 billion she raised over 12 years after going live in Walgreens stores, and she was able to raise that money because she said to those investors who came in those last rounds, look, obviously our product is for real and works. Otherwise, we wouldn't have commercialized it in Walgreens stores. So she used the commercialization of the product to attract more than $700 million in funding in late 2013, 2014, and 2015. So that's basically securities fraud. It certainly has been called that by the SEC and its charges. And then the other reason is that they went live with this non-working technology, and they exposed patients to faulty blood tests. But they also lied to regulators. They didn't show regulators that the part of their lab downstairs that contained the modified Siemens machines and the Edison machines. They only showed regulators the upstairs part that had regular machines running regular venous draws. And so one regulator in particular, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the chief regulator of clinical labs in this country, was hoodwinked by Theranos, and you could make a case that the FDA was also misled. So I think if charges are filed, they'll include securities fraud charges, and they'll also include charges of lying to federal officials, and probably there will be some Medicare conspiracy charges too.
Yeah, when you see the story of the two labs that she had going simultaneously, it does remind you, though, of Bernie Madoff's two trading rooms that he had going.
Right. I mean, there is a parallel there. I think the difference with Theranos is that they still had a hope, they meaning Elizabeth Holmes and her boyfriend Sunny Balwani, that the last iteration of the technology, which they called the mini lab, which they had in development and which was merely a prototype that didn't work, I think they had high hopes that eventually they would get it to work, and that eventually they would get to a point where they'd be able to use it in the lab and produce accurate results. And I think their game all along was to hope that the development of that technology caught up with all the promises they had made. The problem is that the gap between the promises and the reality of the technology became too enormous to bridge. And so I would say that's the difference between Theranos and Madoff.
It's the ultimate game of fake it till you make it.
Right, which is something that's been going on in Silicon Valley for 40 years. There was a term coined in the early 80s called vaporware to describe companies that announced newfangled software or computer hardware with great fanfare, and then either didn't deliver it or delivered versions of it that didn't have the features that had been promised. And, Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison and others were all accused of engaging in the practice at one time or another. The difference in this case is that the product was a medical product. The vaporware usually referred to software, and we've had generations of vaporware. I mean, Twitter was notorious for having a service that was buggy and that had frequent outages, but ultimately, aside from frustration, it didn't affect really people's lives, or it didn't endanger people's lives. The Theranos product was a blood testing machine that doctors and patients relied on for blood test results that they then used to make important health decisions. It's a whole new ballgame when you enter the realm of medicine.
And John, finally, in the minute or two we have left, talk a little bit about Elizabeth Holmes, where she came from, who she was.
Right. So she was raised in Washington, D.C. Her dad was a public servant for most of his career, worked at agencies like the State Department and USAID. Her mom had been a congressional aide until she interrupted her career to raise Elizabeth and her younger brother, Christian. The interesting thing about Elizabeth's lineage is that she was a descendant of the Fleischmann yeast family. The Fleischmann yeast company was founded in the late 1880s by two Hungarian immigrants, Charles and Max Fleischmann, who came to America and created this company that became incredibly successful. And by the turn of the 20th century, the Fleischmanns and the Holmeses were one of the richest families in America. And so Elizabeth grew up with these stories that her father would tell her about the great successes of the Fleischmann family. But he also made sure to tell her about the failures of the younger generations of the family, because his grandfather and his father had squandered the family fortune and had cycled through marriages, struggled with alcoholism, and had essentially frittered away the money. And so I think those stories were very influential as she grew up, and played somewhat of a role in her psychology.
John Carreyrou, the book is Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup, and we should say soon to be a major motion picture, yes?
That's right. Jennifer Lawrence is attached to play Elizabeth Holmes. The director is going to be Adam McKay, who directed The Big Short. And Vanessa Taylor, who co-wrote The Shape of Water, is currently working on a screenplay.
John, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.